1, 2, 3, 4.
When you saw your mother's diamonds, did you recollect the pain that she doesn't care that you were forgotten son? If I showed you that the oceans were just a drop of rain, would it lead you back to the day you lost the war? I don't mean to bring you down before tomorrow, but I need to leave you there before we've lost the sun. I don't mean to bring you down too hard tomorrow, but I need to take you there before.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Stench of Truth. Every Friday from 7 to 9 p.m. Eastern Time on the Inception Radio Network here at inceptionradionetwork.com. And usually I have a guest with me, and today is no exception, where we talk about various subjects of interest to me and to the listeners, mostly revolving around conspiracy, the paranormal, and other strange and mysterious phenomena. And today will be a very interesting show, as we have as our guest Marcus Allen, who is with Nexus magazine in the UK. And you can find them at nexusmagazine.com. Also, Marcus is well known in the debating community when it comes to talking about the Apollo moon landings, which will be the focus of the show today. And we're going to loosely base our show today around the work of Mary Bennett and David S. Percy, and that book is called Dark Moon, Apollo and the Whistleblowers, which goes on to look at some of the anomalies in the photography and look at some of the other anomalies associated with the Apollo moon landing story as we have been told it by NASA, and also posits an alternative theory as to what may have really occurred as for an official and real story about the going to the moon missions of 1969 and onward. So, Marcus, are you there with us?
I'm here with you, Ted, and very pleased to be with you as well.
Oh, I'm very pleased to have you. Marcus is in the UK, and it's like the middle of the night over there, and he's raring to go for our show today, so we all want to thank him for spending the evening with us here. So let me ask you something, Marcus. How long have you been with Nexus?
I've been with Nexus for 17 years. I actually introduced Nexus magazine into the UK after I was made redundant from a very good job I had with the Toyota Motor Corporation. And one day they decided they didn't like me, so I thought, well, a magazine. I like that magazine. I could sell magazines. I could sell cars, so I'll give it a go. Nexus actually comes from Australia. That's where the magazine is actually produced and edited. The editor is Duncan Rhodes. And there will be, for American listeners who are familiar with Nexus, you may have had withdrawal symptoms for the last few months because Nexus hasn't actually been available. There's been a bit of a hiatus on the availability in the United States, but it will be available as of December in the United States at your normal bookstore. So that's the good news. The bad news is that you'll have to come over to the UK or phone us or get us on email or on the web to get your back issues, the ones you've missed, because they're always worth a read.
Oh, absolutely. I can highly recommend Nexus magazine myself. I frequently pick up a copy. Well, I used to at Borders Books, but now they're out of business, so I have to find a new bookstore to go to. But I would always pick up a copy of Nexus because they always had some very interesting topics in there. Well worth a read, and I highly recommend it to everybody out there. So if you're interested if you're interested in looking into some strange phenomenon, things that touch on health, on the paranormal, on hidden history, all kinds of things like that, Nexus is a good magazine for you. So, I definitely recommend it. It's a good one. So the next question for you then, Marcus, would be how did you originally get involved in the Apollo moon landing sort of history there?
It goes back many years. I'm old enough to have been around when it actually happened. I was living in London when it happened, and I remember at that time it was about 3 o'clock in the morning was the live landing, or the alleged live landing, I should say. I even looked out of my window at the moon and thought, wow, there's men up there. This is wonderful. And for many years, I, like many people, believed that what I had been told by NASA was the unvarnished truth. And continued to believe that until, ironically, I heard a presentation given by an American. Some of you may be familiar with David Hatcher Childress, who's the owner of Adventures Unlimited Press. And he was giving a talk over here in the UK many, many years ago, and then almost in passing, he said, of course, those Apollo landings didn't really happen the way we were shown, you know. And I thought, what is he talking about? How can you say something like that? He said, just have a look at the photographs, you'll start seeing the problems. Now, I was at that time working as a photographer in London, and I handled the equipment, or similar equipment to that used by the astronauts, the Hasselblad cameras. I used the films that were used, their ectochrome transparency material. So I knew what cameras can and can't do. I looked at the pictures. The more I looked at them, the more I thought, some mysterious things here. What? It doesn't add up. What we're being told doesn't add up. And I thought, well, there's not much more I can do than just sort of have a doubt about it. This was the last part of sort of mid-1990s, really. So this was well before the internet came into its own, and this was before you could just tap a few buttons and come up with a magnificent collection of photographs that are available now on the NASA website. Next point that really sort of sparked my whole interest in the last 15 years was hearing a presentation again given by David Percy, who was at that time working on his book Dark Moon, Apollo and the Whistleblowers. And he went into considerable detail. Now, David Percy is actually a filmmaker, so he understands photography. He understands cameras and lighting and all the technical aspect of it, which was the part that interested me. So the more I heard what he was saying, he gave a very comprehensive presentation. I thought, yeah, David Childress was right. There is a problem that needs to be looked at here. So I started looking at it in more detail myself, looking at the photographs. I got a set of photographs. They were originally a set of postcards that were available, which you could buy at an astronomy shop. And the more I looked at them, the more I became convinced that there was a question to be answered. Was it real? And the more I looked at it, the more I concluded that the answer to that question is no, it's not. Now, a lot of people will, in some cases, violently disagree with that conclusion. So I'm quite glad I'm over here in the UK and not local. But for the last 15 years, I've been giving presentations myself on the subject over here in the UK. I've given them in Nepal as well, in Amsterdam. A lot of people are interested, becoming more interested in this. And my first major exposure on this was I appeared on British television at the time of the 30th anniversary of the Apollo landings in 1999, appeared on national television, just raising the question about the anomalies in the photographs and the strange ability for NASA to land so many people on the moon, orbit so many people around the moon. 25 different astronauts were orbited around the moon. 12 actually allegedly landed. And this raised the question. Now then, that was followed in 2001 by the TV show, Conspiracy Theory, Did We Land on the Moon? Which probably brought it to the attention of a great many more people. A much wider audience was available now to question it. And NASA actually set up a special department of how to handle the queries they were being asked about from school teachers in America. Because this program not only was shown back in 2001, it was repeated fairly soon afterwards, much to the annoyance of many of the people who would defend NASA. And there are many people who will defend NASA vehemently. I've had a few of them contact me by email to make all sorts of disparaging comments about me, but that is the point at which I know they've lost the plot. As soon as you start attacking somebody personally, you've lost the plot, because you're not answering the questions that are being raised. My personal position is totally irrelevant on this. What I raise are technical queries that need to be addressed and need to be answered. And this is what David Percy and Mary Bennett have done with their book Dark Moon. There is a slight subtext to this, which maybe puts it into context a little bit. David Percy's father-in-law worked for NASA many years ago. David Percy's father-in-law has actually now passed on. But he just said one thing to David, knowing he was a filmmaker. He said, David, examine the Apollo record. That's all he said. Examine the Apollo record. And David thought, why would he ask me to do that? So he did. He, out of courtesy more than anything else to start with, he started to look at the Apollo record, which is basically the photographs and the films, the interviews, the books, the magazine articles. This is all the Apollo record. Of course, now it's much more easily available. You can go onto the NASA website. You can look at every photograph ever taken in space. It takes a long time because there are tens of thousands of them. But David started that process. He started the process of examining the Apollo record. And the more he examined it, as he says in the book, the more he was uncovering a conspiracy of fairly large proportion, because it just didn't add together. The whole Apollo record appears to be almost unbelievable when you start examining it in detail. This is not the PR spin that's been put on the whole Apollo program. I mean, for example, we can all name some of the Apollo astronauts. They're all very famous people. They're all public figures. How many people can name half a dozen shuttle astronauts, for instance, other than those who regrettably died in the 2 accidents that the shuttle experienced? Probably very few, because they're scientists. They're people who are dedicated to the work that they do. And by the way, I'm not questioning any part of the shuttle program at all. That is totally real, exactly as reported. But the main point about Apollo is there is only one source of information, and that source is NASA. From the moment the rocket lifts off from, as it was then, Cape Canaveral, Cape Kennedy in Florida, on the East Coast, as soon as the rocket lifted off, NASA was the sole source of information as to what was occurring for the next however many days the mission was due to last. As soon as the parachutes descended from the sky and the capsule was landed in the Pacific Ocean and picked up by various ships, in between those 2 events, NASA is the sole source of information. If NASA stands for never a straight answer, according to the New York Times, then we have a problem in identifying the truth as to exactly what happened. So we have to examine the evidence, and this is what I've been doing.
Okay, well, that sounds like a very it's a very detailed look at how you have come to the position that you're in, where you look at this. I guess one bottom line thing that maybe we should get out of the way at first here is, do you state that no astronauts actually went to the moon?
A good question, Ted. And it's a very hard one to answer, ironically, because I have actually not seen any evidence that I can conclusively prove from that evidence that man has landed on the moon. Well, no, I'll put this another way. The named astronauts have not necessarily landed on the moon, because what is the evidence that they have done? Well, anybody will say, well, it would be so ridiculous. They're famous people, they're men who have stood the test of time. They've been questioned extensively. They're in the public eye. Of course they landed on the moon. How can you possibly say anything so ridiculously stupid as that? I say, okay, this is what you have to do. Look at the photographs that were taken of those astronauts on the moon and answer me one question. How was the film that the photographs were taken with, how was that film protected from the acknowledged dangers of radiation in space and specifically on the lunar surface? How was that film protected? Because if the astronauts chose to undergo the dangers of radiation in space, and they are considerable, if they chose to do that out of whatever sense of duty, that is entirely their affair, and they can do that. The one thing you cannot change is the physics of how photographic film is affected by radiation. You may remember a few years ago, if you were passing through airport security, you were always advised not to put your camera through the X-ray machine, but to have it hand searched, because the X-ray machines were powerful enough to actually damage the photographic film inside the camera. Now, X-ray machines are slightly more sophisticated now, and they don't emit quite such heavy levels of radiation. But the point about it is that X-rays, which occur in space, is all produced by the sun. Radiation is produced from the sun. It's in the electromagnetic spectrum, part of which is visible light. But part of it is invisible, and it is X-rays, it's gamma rays, it's all the radiation that we're told the hole in the ozone layer would let through if we didn't stop using aerosols, which is another story and a completely different issue, but it demonstrates that radiation is a danger to human life. It's also a danger to photographic film, which is why when you bought photographic film, in the days before digital cameras, you would buy your film, and it always had an expiry date on it. It was several years into the future, normally, and you probably didn't bother about it, but the reason for that expiry date was the radiation damage the film would suffer if it was just left lying around for any length of time. It does suffer radiation damage, and on the moon it's much worse. So how was the camera protecting the film? How was it protected? I don't know. There is no answer to that.
Indeed. There is also another very critical point when it comes to the idea of the film itself, and that is the extremes of temperature as well.
Exactly. The temperature on the moon is, it varies. If you're in sunlight, it's about 100 degrees centigrade, boiling point of water and above. If you're in the shadow, it's minus 100 degrees centigrade, which is colder than any place on Earth, including Antarctica and Siberia. Lowest temperature recorded on Earth, I believe, is about minus 80 degrees centigrade. On the moon, it is way beyond that. It's minus 100. Now, at that temperature, cameras don't work. If you get, the camera that was used, the Hasselblad EL500 electric motor drive, had batteries in it, little torch batteries, sort you go into a shop and buy. Over in the UK, we call them D2 batteries. I don't know if the same designation applies in America, but they're the sort of ones that are about 2 inches high, 1 inch in diameter, that sort of size. And these were used, or two of them used in the camera. They powered the motor that advanced the film in the camera. It was the only automatic part of the camera. I don't know if you've ever tried getting into your car when the temperature is about minus 20 or something and tried to start it after a cold night, but it's going to give your battery a pretty good beating, and it won't want to do it too often. But on the moon, these cameras, and let's face it, when the camera is in the shade, and I mean the shade of anything, whether it's the astronaut or the lunar lander or whatever, if it's in the shade, it's minus 100 degrees centigrade. And this can... sorry, are we getting interference here?
There was a little bit of echoing, but you sound okay now.
Oh, that's good. Okay. Yeah, I was just saying about the temperature. This can be demonstrated quite conclusively as a result of a short experiment conducted on the space shuttle in the early days of the space shuttle, when astronauts, as you may recall, had to work outside the space shuttle if they were launching satellites or repairing satellites or doing any external work. They had to get into full space kit gear. You can't wear half a spacesuit. You've got to wear the whole lot.
Indeed.
Gloves, boots, helmet, the lot. And they're a bit bulky. And it's not easy to work with small pieces of kit. And they were complaining that their fingers, because, all right, you recall the space shuttle orbits the Earth 250 miles up, where the space station is now. And every time it orbits, it goes into the Earth's shadow for half the orbit and in the sunlight for the other half. It takes about 90 minutes to orbit the Earth, so 45 minutes in sunlight, 45 minutes in shadow. When it's in shadow, it's very cold. And the astronauts were complaining that their fingers were actually getting so cold they couldn't operate any of the equipment that they were being asked to use. So they wanted heated gauntlets so that they could keep their hands warm when it was in the shadow of the Earth. And NASA didn't believe them and said, oh, come on, you're making a fuss, guys. You know, you've got the right stuff up there, surely. You know, get on with it. And they said, no, it's very cold. So NASA, okay, well, we'll do an experiment. We'll send a thermometer up or some means of measuring the temperature, and we'll see what the temperature is as you go into the shadow and the temperature as you come into sunlight. And sure enough, within a few minutes of entering the sunlight area of the orbit, the temperature increased to 100 degrees centigrade. As it went into the shadow, decreased rapidly to minus 100 degrees. Because it decreased rapidly because there's nothing to keep the heat in. There's no atmosphere in space. It's a vacuum. Which is a very good insulator, but it doesn't insulate you if you haven't got a heat source. If you have a heat source like heated gauntlets, yeah, you'll stay warm because you're providing alternative heat. So having discovered that, and this was in the 1980s that this was done, after the space shuttle was first launched, when it was still flying safely in the early 1980s. And I thought to myself at the time, this is such a weird experiment to do. Surely they must have known, with the astronauts on the moon, that it got cold when you were in the shadow, and it got warm when you were in the sunlight. And that brought up another point. If you stand a spacecraft on the moon in sunlight, direct sunlight, will it get hot? And the answer is yes, it'll get very hot, rather like your car when you stand it in the sun for any length of time. It gets pretty hot. Slightly different heat on Earth because we have an atmosphere which is makes things operate slightly differently. In space, you've got no atmosphere, you've got a vacuum. But you put anything in space, like a spacecraft, in sunlight, it gets hot. Which is why the astronauts had to wear suits which carried cooling liquid to remove the heat that they would gain. Now, you can do the calculation very easily. Use what's called the Stefan-Boltzmann constant, which will give you the temperature of any black body in space, black body radiation. It's normally, if it's in space, and there's no atmosphere, Earth would be a frozen rock. But because we have an atmosphere and because we have heat from the sun, the temperature of the Earth is, on average, about 15 degrees centigrade. If we didn't have the atmosphere, if it was just a black body, that you can calculate it would be minus 18 degrees centigrade. So the point about that is that not only will the spacecraft get very hot and be pretty uncomfortable to live in, but you have to remove that heat for humans to survive. Equipment, it doesn't matter. You can have the temperature, anything you like. Humans have to have a reasonable temperature. About 20 degrees centigrade is a comfortable temperature, 20, 25 degrees, for humans to survive and work, which is what the astronauts were supposedly doing on the moon, working. They weren't there for the sightseeing. They were there for the, well, I say the scientific work. There was very little science done. It was a political event, the whole of Apollo. But we can come to that later if it would fit in with the discussion. But
Indeed.
If they were on the moon, they had to be kept cool. So if you're sitting in a spacecraft and you've taken your spacesuit off, you have an atmosphere in that spacecraft. You have to. Humans can't survive in a vacuum. You have to have a pressurized environment. It was pressurized to 5 pounds per square inch. Normal atmospheric pressure on Earth here is 14 pounds per square inch. Humans can survive at 5 pounds per square inch, so that's what they were provided with. That means the atmosphere inside the spacecraft was getting very, very hot. How was it cooled? How was the heat removed from the spacecraft? Because in space, which is a vacuum, what surrounded that spacecraft was the best insulator of them all, the vacuum of space. How was the heat removed? And I still don't know the answer to that, because there is no obvious means on the diagrams of the lunar lander of how the heat was removed.
That's actually a really good question, and in fact, you're bringing up the the experiment conducted by the shuttle is extremely relevant, as you pointed out. It would indicate quite clearly that NASA never before felt the need to have heated gauntlets for the astronauts, since they were obviously flabbergasted by the idea that the astronauts working in space were complaining about their hands being cold and too cold to actually conduct work. So it absolutely belies the fact that any of the Apollo astronauts would have been fitted with gloves that would have served that purpose. And in fact, if you look at the Apollo astronaut suits, you can clearly see that probably by the standards of the space shuttle suits were quite primitive by comparison, and certainly had no ability to warm the hands. And as far as the spacecraft itself, now it is, from my understanding, the spacecraft did in fact have a way to produce heat to keep the astronauts from freezing in space because of the cold. But when the level reached a certain point, you raise an exceptional point there. How is it that they actually are able to get rid of any excess heat that they would have within them? Because obviously with no way for it to radiate away, being that you're in a vacuum, it would seem that any application of heat would be accumulative.
Exactly. Now, it is possible to radiate heat away in a vacuum. You do it by accumulating the heat in basically a metal plate. And through radiation rather than convection, heat can be radiated away, but it's a very slow process, and it's not something which I think can remove the amount of heat. Now, you mentioned the point about them getting cold in the spacecraft, and there's quite an emphasis put on how cold they were sitting on the lunar surface, or how cold they were in Apollo 13 as they had to power the whole spacecraft down, they had no electricity, and how cold they got. And I'm thinking, hang on a minute, they're in bright sunlight. How are they getting cold? Because that didn't make sense to me, that they were getting cold while sitting basically in the radiant energy of the sun, which is what we get heated by here on Earth, the radiant energy of the sun. with no means of removing it or taking excess heat away. They certainly weren't getting cold. They were getting hot. And the other point that comes up, and I think is again relevant, is to do with sound in space. Now, at this point, everybody will say, oh, sound doesn't travel in space. You know, the famous phrase, in space, no one can hear you scream. That's
Indeed.
You can't hear anybody scream in space because sound needs an atmosphere through which to travel. The part of the Apollo program was the famous landing, or the alleged landing, I should say, of Apollo 11, the Eagle space lunar lander, on July 1969. And there's a famous commentary that normally accompanies the famous landing. And the voice you hear is actually Buzz Aldrin reading off a set of figures to Neil Armstrong, telling him how many feet per second the spacecraft is descending and how many feet across the ground it's traveling. So you're saying things like 3.5 down, 4 across, that sort of thing. The point is you could hear him. The commentary was quite clear. So my question is, how could you hear that commentary? And the answer is, obviously, well, they were wearing their spacesuits and they were, you could hear it through the transmission. End of story. No, not end of story. Because Neil Armstrong, if you recall, had taken over manual control of the spacecraft because he was going to land in a big pile of boulders or lump of rock, and because they hadn't got the landing site sorted properly. The point is, he was flying the craft manually, which meant that he had to operate the dials and switches and the levers to fly this thing. And if you look at a picture of the inside of a lunar module, it is not designed to be flown by somebody wearing a spacesuit. The switches are far too small. They're far too close together. And here's the next question. Would you operate a computer keyboard if your life depended on it? Because that's what Neil Armstrong was doing. They input figures into this computer keyboard. It's a basic set of figures because the codes were pretty basic. But he was still operating it and inputting codes. And hang on, you can't do that wearing armored gauntlets and be sure that you hit the right button at the right time. I'm sorry, I don't believe it. Which means that he wasn't wearing his spacesuit when he was landing the craft, which means that 2 feet below him was a 10,000-pound, a 10,000-pound thrust rocket that was firing to slow the craft down from lunar orbit. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen a 10,000-pound thrust rocket going off, but they don't have silencers. It makes a bit of a racket. All right, in space you can't hear anything. No, but you can feel the vibration. And if the spacecraft was pressurized with an atmosphere to allow the astronauts to operate the control panels without wearing a spacesuit, you would hear the vibration of the rocket on the commentary, and you don't. So my contention is that everything we've heard and seen about Apollo was filmed and recorded during the training and simulation exercises, which were no big secret. Everybody knew they were going on. Of course they were filming and recording them because they would then debrief the astronauts as to how they should operate at any given time, because nobody had been to the moon at that point. Nobody knew what to expect when you got there, so they had to do all the various options that were available to ensure that they didn't crash the thing when they got there, and they could land it out of orbit. So, of course, they did a lot of training, a lot of simulation. Of course it was filmed, of course it was photographed, of course it was recorded. And my contention is that most, if not all, of the Apollo record that we are told continuously by NASA is a record of man's landing on the moon is not. It's not a fabrication. It wasn't filmed in Area 51, regrettably. It was filmed in the various mock-ups around America, from Washington State through to California, to Florida, to Texas, to Virginia, to Maryland. A lot of different places had different mock-ups. There's nothing secret about them at all. And there was nothing secret about the filming of it either. Now, if NASA had said, yeah, well, we did get to the moon, guys, just as we said we did, and they did take the films, and they did take the pictures, and when they got them back, we'd forgotten about the radiation, the films were all fogged and damaged, we couldn't show them, so we've used the simulation exercise pictures instead, because everybody wants to know what it looks like. And this is what it looks like. Ask the guys who've been there, they'll tell you. If NASA had said that, I don't have a problem with that as an explanation. But no, they don't say that. What they say is, these photographs, these films, were taken on the lunar surface by the named astronauts. Sorry, guys, doesn't add up, doesn't make sense, isn't correct, is a big lie. Oh, got that off the chest.
Well, that's quite fascinating, Marcus. Obviously, you've pointed out several very interesting things there, and obviously Percy and Bennett in their book point out many of the photographic anomalies which seem to indicate that most, if not all, of the photographs could not have been taken on the moon. But I think the one thing, as you pointed out very early on when we first started, it seems that the apologists for NASA seem to avoid certain issues that are troublesome, and they instead go into this pseudo-skepticism realm of attacking other issues that they're more strongly based on, rather than taking on the tough questions when it comes to addressing the Apollo missions themselves. Now, you had mentioned in your commentary that the Apollo mission was a political stunt. And would you care to elaborate on that a little bit for us?
Yeah, certainly. It's interesting you mentioned the NASA apologists. I've come across a few of them, and they're sincere people. They genuinely believe what they say, but I've yet to have a good photographer make comment about it. Most of these apologists, they're either astronomers, they're psychologists, they're university people. They're the skeptic community. I've met them. They're nice enough people, but basically they're arguing from a very weak position. Now, as for Apollo being a political event, that is, it's necessary to go back in time a little bit to the mid-1960s when Apollo was first proposed by President John Kennedy in May 1961. May the 21st it was, when he made his famous speech at the Joint House of Congress. We will land a man on the moon before the decade is out and return him safely to the Earth. That was his challenge. Not because it was easy, but because it was hard. It was a great challenge. He was a charismatic man, and he captured the imagination of a generation who said, yeah, let's do it. This is what America does so well. They take a challenge and run with it, and usually invariably succeed. Now, at that point, May 1961, no American had been into space. They certainly hadn't been into orbit around the moon. The Russians, on the other hand, had, and in April 1961, the alleged first man into space, first man to orbit, Yuri Gagarin, was feted as a hero around the world, and America were embarrassed and upset. And this is why Kennedy made his statement. It was made 6 weeks after Gagarin orbited the moon. Now, Gagarin, contrary to popular belief, was not the first Russian into orbit. He wasn't even the second or the third. He was the 10th. 8 of them had died in orbit. 8 of them... The Russians didn't tend to publicize their mistakes. They tended to over-dramatize their successes. He wasn't... the first man to orbit the Earth was a guy called Vladimir Ilyushin, the son of the aircraft designer in Russia. He was a test pilot, a highly respected scientist, an obvious choice as being representative of the Russian scientific community and the Air Force community in Russia. Unfortunately, his craft landed with him inside it in China. China and Russia in those days, in 1961, didn't get on too well. And the Chinese basically looked after him. They rescued him. He took about 6 months to recover. He was eventually returned to Russia, badly injured. And the Chinese, now the confirmation of this, which is a pretty controversial thing to say, because not many people are even aware of this happening. The confirmation that something like this did occur, that the Russians were actually not telling the whole truth about their space program, and we'll come on to a little bit more of that in a minute, was that the Russians did not, after Gagarin had safely landed, he came down by parachute, by the way, which is not supposed to have happened. After he landed, he was feted and taken around the world on diplomatic missions, and wherever there was a diplomatic event, the Chinese did not attend, as if to say, look, we know that you're not actually telling the truth here, but we're not going to make a big song and dance about it because we're not actually sure what really happened. The point is that Gagarin was not the first into orbit. And the reason that we know all this is because two Italian ham radio operators called Achille and Gianni Giudica Cordiglia in Turin were recording and listening in to the Russian cosmonaut conversation with their main base in Kazakhstan at Baikonur. And they heard all these things going. They heard astronauts dying in space. They heard people unable to land their craft and saying, I can't do any more. It's too hot. I can't live. They heard all this recorded. America knew this. There was a big article in the Reader's Digest about these two brothers. They were quite famous at the time, and it was known what was going on. America knew about it. Obviously, NASA knew about it, which is then the answer to the question, well, if what you say about the Americans not landing on the moon is true, why didn't the Russians blow the whistle? The Russians didn't blow the whistle because they had as much to hide as the Americans did. There was a conspiracy of silence amongst the space community. This is something, a journey just coming out now. So having heard all these conversations going on, America had to make a political move to demonstrate to the world. Now, what else is going on in the 1960s? The Vietnam War is starting to build up. It's going to get pretty unpleasant before the end of the decade. The Tet Offensive and all that. Those too young to remember it, check it out on Google. There was the student riots that were going on at Higher University, where students were being shot dead by the National Guard. President Kennedy was assassinated. Robert Kennedy was assassinated. Martin Luther King was assassinated. America's in meltdown. Politically, there's a vast amount going on. The Vietnam War, as I say, getting pretty unpleasant. The assassinations going on. The space race. America couldn't be seen to come second in anything. And the space race, particularly, it couldn't be seen to come second. So, if you can't make it, you fake it. And I would say, and I don't have the evidence to back this up yet, that somewhere around the mid-1960s, at the time the Apollo program was starting to gather momentum following the Mercury and the Gemini programs, which were commenced in 1962, went through. That was the single spacecraft, the Gemini, the double spacecraft, to the Apollo spacecraft, which carried 3 astronauts. Around the mid-1960s, it must have become blindingly obvious with the scientific research that had gone on up to that point that sending man into space beyond the Van Allen radiation belts was not only extremely risky, but was likely to end in death live on television. Because NASA had regrettably made the announcement that the whole thing was going to be televised live. You can't have astronauts dying live on television. It just doesn't work. And it's not very good PR.
No, it's not. No, it's not. A break right now, Marcus. So
okay.
fascinating discussion here. We're going to talk more about the Apollo missions themselves and the political stunt that Marcus is pointing out to us as something that was politically necessary there at the end of the 1960s as a way to boost the credibility of the American political establishment in the face of a lot of things that were going on at home, which, of course, if people are old enough, will remember a lot of the major things that were happening during the late 1960s, such as the assassinations and the school riots and the anti-war protests and all of these sorts of things. So we've heard these stories before from other people. We'll talk a little bit more about this as well, and we'll get into some other issues.
Jamie Havoc in here. Let me tell you something if you have not heard. There is a magazine out there. Many say it is the best ufology magazine in the world, and I highly agree. UFO Mag. If you're not a subscriber, please go there. UFOmag.com is the best ufology magazine in the world. Keep up to date on UFO news, subjects, and everything in ufology with some of the best writers around. For Inception Radio listeners only, usually it's $19.95 for 5 issues. If you mention Inception Radio, you get 6 issues for $19.95. Go there now, UFOmag.com. Tell them Jamie sent you. I'll see you there. Hey guys, Jamie Havoc in here for RC International Radio. That's right. You heard it. RC International Radio. If you're wondering what RC stands for on a ufology and paranormal network, it is radio controlled. And it is hosted by myself, Jamie Havoc, and my sidekick, Donnie Eatman. Every Saturday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, 8 a.m. Pacific. Tune in, call in, ask questions. Do what me and Donnie been up to, upgrading our cars. And listen to stories from other people who call in and share their experiences or ask for advice. That's RC International Radio, Saturdays, 11 a.m. Eastern. I'll see you there.
Hello, folks. Grace Hobbs here for the Inception Radio Network, reminding you to catch the Paranormal Guys radio show. If you like everything in the paranormal, you're going to love Pang Radio. Broadcasting live from the shores of Lake Superior in northern Wisconsin, MJ brings the brightest minds and the best investigators to the show for in-depth interviews, all the while taking questions from the interactive chat, as well as toll-free call-in questions. It's live. It's every Sunday night at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 Pacific, and it's Pang Radio with MJ right here on the Inception Radio Network.
Hi, Bob Tarmac for MJ'sHealthyWay.com. Are you into vitamins, nutrition, meal replacements, health shakes? Keeping your body in good shape, your internal engine going. Boy, do I have a perfect place for you. MJ'sHealthyWay.com. They offer the best service and products, and they'll tell you anything you need to know about any product they have to offer. I get all my vitamins, meal replacements, shakes from MJ'sHealthyWay.com. That's spelled MJSHealthyWay.com. There's so much more at the website. Go check it out. MJ'sHealthyWay.com.
Hey guys, Jamie Havoc in here to let you know about this Friday's show. It's going to be a killer show because I'm going to have an amazing guest and an amazing co-host. Our guest is going to be Christine Tulk. She is the youngest granddaughter of Sheriff Wilcox. That, if you don't know, he was the sheriff during the Roswell incident. She's going to come on to share her experience. She's going to talk about her grandma, Inez Wilcox, that she traveled the world and started a church. We're going to talk about Christine's extraterrestrial experiences. Also about when she would go to Walter Holt's house for gatherings, the people that she met there and their conversations, and her parents seeing the box of metal and their impressions. Also, we're going to be talking about an alien body that a lot of people that research Roswell do not know about. And my co-host of the night, Mr. Bill Burns. So don't miss this one. Friday night, 9 p.m. Eastern Time, right after the Stench of Truth on InceptionRadioNetwork.com. And I hope you like the new site. Just click live chat and you're there. I'll see you Friday night, 9 p.m. Eastern.
And welcome back to the Stench of Truth radio show here on InceptionRadioNetwork.com every Friday from 7 to 9. This week I have as my guest Marcus Allen from the UK. He is with the Nexus magazine in the UK, a magazine that I can highly recommend to everybody who's interested in looking at diverse phenomenon. Everything from the paranormal to alternative health topics is discussed within the magazine. So if you're interested in looking for a source for interesting material for research and for reading about, you can check out Nexus, and that's at nexusmagazine.com. And Marcus has also been involved with the Apollo moon landings debate about the NASA story, about what is the real story about the Apollo moon landings. He has been involved with this discussion for many years now, and he is with us today to talk about some of the things related to the official NASA story and some of the reasons why we cannot believe what NASA is telling us about the Apollo moon landings. And just before we went on break, we were talking about some of the political reasons that were very preeminent during the time that the first Apollo landing happened in 1969, that would have put pressure on the United States government to come up with a major coup, if you will, in a publicity vein to show that America was still the great place to be and still offered, some kind of hope for a future and all of these sorts of things that, are cliches nowadays, but certainly had value back then. So I'll pass it back over to Marcus, and he can finish what he was on the vein he was talking about. So take us away, Marcus.
Indeed. That's a good summary, and thank you for your kind comments about Nexus magazine. It's a magazine I've been associated with for some time. I'm sure the editor in Australia will be delighted with your commendation. The political aspect of Apollo is probably the most interesting side of it, because it doesn't appear on face value that there is a political aspect to Apollo. It's promoted by NASA, never a straight answer. It's promoted by NASA as being a scientific endeavor. And to an extent it was a scientific endeavor, insofar as 400,000 people were working on Apollo at the height of the program in the mid to late 1960s. By the time Apollo was launched to the moon in 1968, with Apollo 8, which orbited the moon, that famous Christmas broadcast that people got a little upset about and a lot of people thought was quite interesting. Again, it was a PR exercise. It was promoting NASA. It was promoting the endeavors that NASA had undertaken in the previous 7 years to get man to the moon. This was in order to convince the great American taxpayer that their money was being well spent, because a lot of money was being spent. There was a degree of criticism of the space program because it didn't appear to have any end result that anybody could see, which is a bit short-sighted because the end result was employment of pretty impressive scientific brain to come up with many of the rockets and the spacesuits and the rovers and the control centers and all the paraphernalia that went with launching rockets to the moon. All the money, by the way, was not spent in space, it was spent here on Earth. Every dollar that was used was paying somebody for their time in developing these technological marvels as they were at the time. So that side of it, the criticism of NASA for what it did, I thought was a little bit overplayed. Because they were spending more money on the Vietnam War, which wasn't producing any decent results, and it was killing people, which wasn't a very sensible thing to be doing. The space program was dangerous. Yes, people did die. In Apollo 1, the fire in the capsule during the test was a bit of a disaster because it killed 3 pretty good astronauts. But any schoolboy could tell you that if you put oxygen, which is what was being used inside the spacecraft, under pressure, it's likely to explode. That's what oxygen does when you put pure oxygen in the close proximity of a spark, which is what happened. And the thing went up in flames, and it was badly designed, and the whole Apollo program was almost stopped at that point because the design side of it was so bad, and it was improved considerably as a result of that. And within 18 months, they were flying out to the moon. Now, the other side of this is that if the Apollo program, which was undertaken using the technology available in the 1960s, took from the time President Kennedy made his announcement in 1961 to the first orbit of the moon in December 1968, just over 7 years it took to achieve that. How come the Constellation program, which has just been cancelled by President Obama, was going to return man to the moon, but it was going to take 20 years to do it? And this was using the technology of the 21st century. It didn't make sense to a lot of people. Maybe that was why President Obama was advised to cancel it, because so many questions were being asked. The other point on that is we come back to the radiation issue. Now, radiation in space is severe. This was established in 1958 by Professor James Van Allen, who persuaded NASA that they should put a Geiger counter onto one of their very first rockets launched into space on Explorer 1 to measure the radiation, which he was convinced was out there in space and surrounded the Earth. And sure enough, Explorer 1 went up, and the Geiger counter broke down. What they discovered later was that it was overwhelmed by the level of radiation. That was established later on Explorer 4, when a Geiger counter measured the levels of radiation in what became known as the Van Allen radiation belts. These are belts of radiation which is produced by the sun and held in place around Earth by the Earth's magnetic field. It's what protects life on Earth, you and me and everybody alive, from certain death from the radiation in space. And you may recall back, I think it was 1989, the electricity circuits, the electrical grid in North America was virtually knocked out, destroyed by an extreme burst of radiation from the sun. It's called a coronal mass ejection, which is one of those enormous flares that come off the sun periodically. If they head towards Earth, they can knock satellites out, they can knock electrical circuits out, and which is what they did. So in space, you've got this serious problem of radiation. Politically, Apollo had to be seen to work for the reasons we've already discussed. It was almost a sideshow. It was almost a distraction. It was the bread and circuses aspect of political life. You also have to recall who was president at the time of the Apollo landings. It was Nixon, Richard Nixon, who had been defeated by President Kennedy in 1960, Richard Nixon, who wasn't best pleased because he felt that Kennedy had bought the election by persuading some of his father's, that's Joe Kennedy's friends, to get out the vote for his son, John Kennedy, which is what happened. I think the difference in votes was about 350,000. It was a very, very close election. So Nixon didn't hold any favors to the Kennedys, which is why Apollo 18, 19, and 20 were cancelled by President Nixon. Hang on a minute. They got all the equipment. They got it all built. It was all there. In fact, two of the Saturn V rockets, which were to be part of the Apollo 18, 19, and 20 missions, two of them were used for Skylab in conjunction with the Soviets, note. So there was high-level cooperation between the Soviets and the Americans in space right through Apollo, right through into Skylab. The famous memo that President Kennedy wrote, one of the last executive orders he issued on November the 11th, 1963, 2 weeks before he was assassinated, was ordering NASA to cooperate with the Soviets. That memo was conveniently buried when the new President Johnson came into power, because he had political influence in Texas and wanted the funding that the space program would provide for his home state. Well, that's fair enough. That's what politicians do. But it shouldn't be ignored in the whole aspect of the political side of Apollo. When you come forward then into the 1960s, Nixon will take the credit for the landing, the famous phone call he made, I'm sitting here in the White House and talking to you on the moon conversation.
Yes.
Broadcast live, which was, great political theatre, nothing to do with science, all to do with politics. And then he turns around and cancels the final 3 Apollo missions. And from that time on, really, NASA has struggled to maintain a foothold in advanced space technology. They managed to build a space station, yeah, but, what's that for?
Exactly. And as you pointed out, 18, 19, and 20 being canceled is one of the greatest enigmas to me when it comes to the Apollo program, because, as you pointed out, the astronauts, the equipment, the rockets, just about everything was bought and paid for and ready to go, and there was absolutely no reason to cancel them for the lack of anything being prepared. I could see if they, didn't have the rockets ready, or if the astronauts weren't trained, or if they didn't have the equipment to do it and this sort of thing, that they might have said, well, budget and this and that, we need more money for other things, whatever. But to have them sitting there and ready to go and then just say, that's it, we're done, that really does boggle my mind anyway.
That's a good point. And I think now we can look back on it, say, without the emotion that was attached to the whole Apollo program. Without that emotion, we can look at it just dispassionately and say, hang on a minute, you're right. They were all bought and paid for. There was no extra expense. The Apollo program was being gradually run down. It was being withdrawn back to Earth orbit, low Earth orbit, where the space shuttle flies. It's as if they were saying, no, we can't do it. It's not because America can't do it. America can do basically what it sets its mind to. If it wants to go to the moon, yeah, it can go to the moon. Whether it got there or not, of course, is a completely different story. And this is really what we're looking at today.
Yes.
America's got to Mars. Now, it's always puzzled me why, having allegedly landed 12 men on the moon relatively easily, no mishaps. Apollo 13 was a wonderful drama, but I don't think it was quite the way it was portrayed. I suspect it never got out of Earth orbit, and there is reasonable evidence that Apollo 13 actually went into Earth orbit and stayed there. And the evidence for that is, if you look at some of the film that was taken on Apollo 13, not the Tom Hanks film, the alleged real film of Apollo 13, We Have a Problem, Houston, that sort of thing, where they are allegedly orbiting around the moon on their way back to Earth. If you look at the film of that, which is available to see, it's quite easy to check it out, you look for the section which shows the 3 astronauts of Apollo 13 sitting rather glumly in the lunar lander, which they used as their lifeboat to get back to Earth. If you look at that section, there's a camera shot which the camera pans across the 3 astronauts sitting, looking towards the control panel where the camera is mounted, but the camera pans from one of the windows right across to the other. They're triangular windows on the lunar lander. And as it goes across these 2 windows, they show bright blue color. Space, as I recall, is black. The only thing blue in space is Earth. It would appear almost as if they were orbiting Earth and they forgot that you shouldn't show blue, which is what see a film of the space shuttle flying, and you get the blue Earth below you. So it's no big deal. The Earth is blue. It's that pale blue dot up in space, the blue marble, the famous photograph. It shows it as blue. But Apollo 13 showing blue out the window when they should have been around the backside of the moon doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense.
And does this fit into the idea of people within the Apollo program actually being whistleblowers and trying to insert various things from time to time within the official record as it was released to the public in order to show that what you're looking at is not an actual document but something concocted by people in order to foster a particular point of view, whether it be a political, something political or something else?
Yeah, it does. This is the main theme of the book Dark Moon, Apollo and the Whistleblowers, where the contention that they come up with is that there are a lot of photographs. There were 32,000 photographs taken on the moon and many other thousands taken around the Apollo program generally, and you can see them all online now, that many of these photographs were deliberately allowed to be placed into the record so that people would eventually notice these, not mistakes, inconsistencies about the record. That's why that phrase I used right at the beginning of our discussion, check the Apollo record, which is what David Percy spent 8 years doing and finally produced the book Dark Moon and a very, very good DVD, which is, I've yet to meet anybody who's watched the DVD. It's called What Happened on the Moon. Anybody who watches that cannot be convinced that the Apollo record is anything other than deeply flawed at best and seriously misleading at worst. So, yes, there were people who were working who would have been producing the photographs, preparing them for public distribution by NASA. There would have been people who would have allowed things to be shown on the photographs, which to somebody who's prepared to spend the time and effort and emotionless investigation would come up with, well, what's that doing there? Or why is that shown like that? They're small things, relative, but when you take them all together, you can dismiss an individual photograph as a mistake. Now, initially, when this whole Apollo query started, it was actually started in 1974. the first publication on the subject was We Never Went to the Moon by Bill Kaysing, who's recently passed on. This was followed up by Ralph Renee, who wrote the book NASA Mooned America. There was another book called Moongate by William Bryan III. There have been this Dark Moon, which is probably the best book on the subject. There's a new one by a German author called One Small Step, Query, by Gerhard Wisniewski. It's published in English now. It's available in the UK. There's been a French book on the subject. And most interestingly, very recently, there have been several Russian studies. Not Soviet, Russian. Quite recently. These are serious scientists in Russia who are examining the Apollo record in public for the first time. And one of the studies was on the Saturn V rocket itself, the takeoff of the rocket. It's been filmed, and you may recall it's a whacking great thing. It's 365 foot high. If anybody's been to the UK, that's the same height as St. Paul's Cathedral, where the Occupy the City protesters are busily camping out in this rather cold night tonight. 365 foot high. The stage one was the first stage, which was the major part of the rocket, and that separated about 50 miles above the surface of the Earth, so that stage two could take over and put the remainder of the rocket and the lunar lander, lunar module, and so on, into Earth orbit prior to its translunar injection, which was set to stage three, would accelerate it to escape Earth's gravity. What they were examining was the separation between stage one and stage two. And because it was filmed quite in some detail by aircraft that were following the rocket, that were filming it, you can calculate the speed that the rocket is traveling at the point of separation. Now, the point about that is that in order to place a given weight into orbit, you need a rocket to have accelerated to a specific speed. I don't know the exact figures, but it makes sense that if you're going to put a heavier weight into orbit, you've got to move it a bit faster off the ground. So you've got to have a more powerful rocket to get it in there. The conclusion he's reached, and the detail of the investigation is actually available on David Percy's website at aulis.com, that's AULIS.com. The Russian investigation indicated that the weight of being launched into space was not heavy enough to represent what was landed on the moon. It was about 10 tons short of the weight required to put a lunar lander, a lunar orbiter, into orbit around the moon. So the assumption from that is that it was unmanned, because it would be in sufficient weight for an unmanned craft to go into orbit around the moon, but not a manned craft, because that would require additional fuel, additional weight, many additional things to keep man alive in orbit around the moon. So if an unmanned craft went to the moon, this would account for much of what has subsequently been photographed by the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, which shows the landers on the lunar surface. Allegedly. It's not clear, and unless NASA, in their wisdom, have decided to point you at the actual little shadow that appears to represent one of the landers, you wouldn't know what you were looking at. It's not very good when you've got cameras that can read a newspaper headline from space and you can't see something the size of a pickup truck on the moon. You're not saying possible.
I'm sorry, but this points back. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Marcus,
No,
but
fine.
it is quite laughable, really, when you think about it, because all of the various photographs that NASA produces from time to time, whether it be of the moon or Mars or anything else that they choose to deign to show us, the resolution is always so incredibly low and just completely inadequate for even like a a basic camera operator here on Earth, just someone that goes into a local store and buys a cheap camera, will have a better resolution picture taken than anything that NASA is showing us of any of these supposed, interstellar or inner solar system bodies. And I'm sorry, but if you're going to send someone to the moon, okay, and you're going to take all of these records of everything, and you want to make sure you have the best stuff, and you show everything the best you can. Number one, are you going to use black and white photographs? Number two, are you going to have such low resolution? And now today, especially, you have orbiters that go around the moon. You've had orbiters that go around Mars, and these things are fitted with cameras that apparently are junk, and that just doesn't make any sense to me.
It doesn't make any sense to me either. You're quite right. I mean, that is a major point. That it was like the photography on Apollo was an afterthought. They thought, we'll show it on television, and even that is debatable. We're told that it was live pictures from the moon. Now, most people at that time, they were shown a screen with a very fuzzy image, which was there's a reason for it. Very fuzzy image, and a big thing flashing at the bottom saying live pictures from the moon. So we all thought, oh, whoopee, he's done it. God, what a wonderful chap. And then we find out that the pictures we were looking at were being transmitted by NASA, having filmed them off a television screen, because the film that was being transmitted back from the moon was being picked up in Australia, and it was then bounced back over the satellites into NASA and transmitted around the world. And then NASA conveniently lost the film, the original film, for years. And suddenly somebody said, well, that film that we took on the moon and transmitted it back to Earth, and we showed it to the world, and it showed the live pictures on the moon, where is it? Because it was recorded on 2-inch Ampex videotape. 2-inch, I mean, it shows how long ago it was.
Yes.
So that film was missing. We were then told it was discovered in a warehouse at the back of a McDonald's somewhere in Kentucky.
I remember the story. I remember that story very well.
And it's unbelievable that something as important as that, one of the seminal events of the 20th century, I lost it. I lost 700 other boxes of film and records. And by the way, the plans for the lunar lander, the lunar rover, and the lunar module were scrapped. They don't exist. Boeing, who built the lunar rover, said, no, we destroyed them. Hang on a minute. Why? Well, what's going on here? Now, there's a point about the spacesuits that we used. You remember these wonderful, rather photogenic spacesuits? They were quite good. They were made by the International Latex Corporation, company that makes women's underwear the rest of the time. But they were very good at making spacesuits. They got the contract to make the spacesuits. And I watched all these astronauts going to the moon, jumping about, taking photographs, falling over, doing all the other things that they did. And I thought, hang on a minute, these spacesuits have obviously protected the astronauts from the radiation in space. Wouldn't it be sensible to use the same spacesuits to equip technicians to go into 3 Mile Island or Chernobyl or now Fukushima and clear up the radiation mess? Because it obviously protected the astronauts on the moon. It must protect people on Earth, because radiation is radiation at the end of the day. So I contacted the company and said, would it protect people working in the nuclear power industry? And they say, well, we built the spacesuit according to the specification NASA provided us. You better ask them. So I did. I'm still waiting for a reply. I'm not holding my breath.
Indeed. I would suggest that that's probably not a good idea. Someone in the chat room posted a comment saying that as the Apollo program progressed, They did eventually progress to better film and eventually did have full-color video and photography and this sort of thing. What is your comment regarding that?
They were using Kodak Ektachrome transparency material, which is color film, on Apollo 11. The film was used, the same film was used throughout the whole Apollo mission, Kodak Ektachrome film. Very, very good film. It's a good choice of film. If you're using it in a Hasselblad camera, which also is a very good choice of camera. It's the best camera you could buy then, the best camera you could buy now. The video, as far as I recall, was always black and white, because the bandwidth required to transmit a color film from the moon. This is not to say they weren't film. There were film taken as well. Ordinary 35mm film. They were used in what was called the data acquisition cameras, which were mounted in the lunar landers. And they were filming in slow motion. They were filming 1 frame per second for the whole time the astronauts were on the surface. They were in color because there's a famous image of Apollo 11 where you've got the astronauts with 2 different shadow lengths. They're both the same height, 6 foot, Aldrin and Armstrong. They're highly unlikely to have a shadow length that one is 50% longer than the other, which is a bit of a mystery. But the same color film was used. They used black and white also. It was Kodak film. For more detailed work, that was the sort of more of the detail, the close-up, because black and white film would record possibly in more detail. Color film, to be honest, it's not really necessary to even have color film on the moon because there's no color up there. There's no color in the sky. There are very little color in the landers or the spacesuits. Black and white would have been a better choice of film, but they chose to use color, and the whole of the Apollo 11 EVA, extravehicular activity, i.e. the moonwalk, is recorded on 1 roll of film. It's magazine 40. It was just the number of the magazine. They weren't using 40 magazines. That was just the number that was used, and you can see every single photograph taken on Apollo 11 on the 2-hour moonwalk. There's 121 images, and they're all good. 1 or 2 not brilliant, but basically they're all good pictures. But there's one major problem about that film. There's no bracketing of exposure. Any professional photographer will tell you you've got to appreciate that these were manually operated cameras. They weren't like the digital stuff we have today, the point-and-shoot cameras that take good photographs no matter what you're doing. Every part of the camera had to be set up. The shutter speed had to be set, the aperture had to be set, the focusing had to be set, all manually, all done by armored gauntlets, by the way. There was no viewfinder on the camera because you couldn't use one in a spacesuit, so you had to point the camera generally in the direction of what you wanted to photograph and press the shutter button, which you couldn't see from inside the spacesuit anyway, and hope you got it right. And my God, they were brilliant, these guys. Every photograph they took, there were no heads cut off, well focused, well exposed, accurately composed, but with no viewfinder. They got the right stuff, certainly. But they're not the world-famous photographers you would expect today. I don't think Armstrong has taken any pictures since, or Aldrin certainly hasn't done much photography. Alan Bean, he's an artist, he's a painter, a very good painter, Apollo 12. I don't know, he's taken too many photographs since then. But you ask any professional photographer to have a look at the Apollo photographs and explain to you how they managed to get the exposures so accurate without an exposure meter and without bracketing the photographs, which means taking the same scene 3 or 4 different exposures, because you don't know exactly what's going to come out. Nobody had been to the moon before. They didn't know what the exposures were supposed to be, but they knew what the exposures were on the simulation sets because they were using professional photographers to do it, who had exposure meters and cameras that they could look through viewfinders. That's what it seems to be. So, in answer to your question, it was the same film that was used throughout all the missions from Apollo 8 to Apollo 17. Kodachrome. If they did use color film, they used it from the beginning. The video was invariably black and white.
Okay.
And I would love to hear a technician, a good video technician, tell me what sort of battery power would be required to drive a video camera filming at 20 frames a second and the bandwidth required to transmit it 250,000 miles back to Earth, or 238,000 if we're going to be precise. The bandwidth required to do that, and the battery power required to ensure no break in transmission, because I don't think they carried sufficient batteries on the craft to do that.
Batteries were then and still are to a large extent very heavy, so
Exactly.
it would have added a tremendous amount of weight to the actual mission weight itself.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
there's some commentary in the chat room about Apollo 13, and I think the general question is, why would Apollo 13, if it was just sitting up in orbit, what was the purpose of faking the entire going around the moon and turning it into a disaster sort of thing?
Well, okay. Apollo 11 received worldwide coverage, blanket coverage. Everybody knew it was going on. Great success. Everybody comes back okay. A few months later, Apollo 12 is launched. And they had a bit of a disaster with Apollo 12. They pointed the camera, the video camera, at the sun, or at a very bright light anyway. And the video camera didn't work from then on, so we're told. There appears to be doubt that that actually happened. But anyway, there was no transmission, there was no pictures being transmitted, and of course if they were photographing, you wouldn't see the pictures till they got back. So there was really nothing going on that people were interested in Apollo 12 because there's nothing to look at. So the audience figures were dropping seriously, and NASA was worried that their PR exercise was being compromised. So the best way to get interest back up again is to have a bit of an emergency. So we launch Apollo 13 and we have a problem, Houston, and we're on the way to the moon, and there's an explosion in one of the oxygen cylinders which power the energy systems and the breathing and all the other things you need in space, like atmosphere and oxygen and heat. Halfway to the moon, big explosion, oxygen tank goes up. And then the first question arises, if you've got an explosion in a spacecraft, won't it throw the spacecraft onto a completely different course? It's like firing a rocket, but from the side, not from the base. But it didn't appear to go off course at all, but it virtually destroyed the spacecraft. So now we have the world and its wife hanging on every transmission from this crippled spacecraft as it staggers back to Earth. And they managed to do course corrections using an Omega watch, and which again is a bit suspicious because, all right, you can fire the rockets to get it back from around the far side of the moon. It's not the dark side, by the way. It's that's the name of the Pink Floyd record. It's the far side. Because the far side has got as much sunlight as the bit we see. It comes back to Earth. Now, landing a spacecraft returning from the moon is a very, very tricky business. What is the speed of approach? If you're coming back from the moon, what is the speed of approach? As you approach Earth, what speed is the spacecraft traveling at? And the answer is very fast indeed, 25,000 miles an hour. It's the same as escape velocity, because you're coming back being pulled by the same gravity that you were trying to escape from. You approach Earth at 25,000 miles an hour, very fast. If you approach at the wrong angle, one of two things will happen. If you come in at too shallow an angle, you bounce off the atmosphere and go into orbit around the sun. Bye-bye. If you come in at too steep an angle, you burn up because the craft can't slow down fast enough. You burn up. We've all seen what happened when spacecraft burn up in space. There's not much left. You have to hit the exact right angle. It's called a window of descent. And that window for a craft coming back from the moon, this is not the space shuttle, that's traveling at only 17,000 miles an hour. It's coming back at 25,000 miles an hour. It's got to hit the atmosphere in a window of about 40 miles wide and about 6 miles deep. It's like a letterbox, which you've got to aim for. And that's not so easy to do. You've got to come in. You don't have a second chance. There are no brakes on a spacecraft. You've got to hit the atmosphere at the right speed. Now, if you hit it at the right speed, the right angle, you will slow down. You will generate an enormous amount of heat. Now, that heat is actually not the friction of the air, as is generally known. What that heat is generated by is the increased pressure of the atmosphere being compressed below the spacecraft as it comes in. It's the same as if you're using a bicycle pump and you compress the air inside it, it heats up. So that's where the heat is coming from, and that heat has to be dissipated. That's why you have the ablative shield, which allows the spacecraft to dissipate the heat. But if you get your angle wrong, you're not going to survive. So we've got that problem as well. How do you get back? And given that the Apollo 13 had very, very little navigation equipment available, they shut the whole spacecraft down. That's why they were sitting in the lunar lander section as opposed to the command module section, because they shut the whole thing down to enable it to survive to get back to Earth. And it did, and it was successful. And we all thought, oh, whoopee, what wonderful chaps, and we'll make a film about it in about 20 years' time.
Okay, we got to take our last break now, Marcus, and then I'll have a couple of very obvious questions that I want to ask you, a couple of more difficult ones for you to answer in our last section here. So everybody listening, stay tuned through the break, and we'll be back with Marcus Allen from Nexus magazine in the UK. We're talking about Dark Moon, Apollo and the Whistleblowers, the Apollo moon landings, fact or fiction, on the Stench of Truth radio. Stay tuned, and we'll have more in a few minutes.
Hi, folks. Race Hobbs here for the Inception Radio Network, and I just wanted to stop by to remind you to catch a really great show here on IRN. It's the Inception Radio Show with my good friend Jamie Havocan. Every Friday night at 9 p.m. Eastern, Jamie brings the biggest names in the paranormal and UFO subject today. Names like Dr. Edgar Mitchell and Stephen Bassett, Stanton Friedman and Jesse Marcel Jr., Patty Greer and Richard Dolan, just to name a few. It's every Friday night at 9 p.m. Eastern. It's live and worldwide. It's the Inception Radio Show with Jamie Havocan right here on the Inception Radio Network.
Imagine no longer being tied down to your computer, but having the freedom to take live talk radio with you anywhere you go. TalkStream Live introduces our first ever iPhone application. The talk shows you follow now follow you, and your iPhone is now the fastest and easiest way to stay connected to the best talk radio on the internet. Let TalkStream Live transform the way you listen to radio. Listen to live talk shows 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Mobile talk radio from TalkStream Live. Now available in the iTunes App Store.
Hey guys, Jamie Havocan here for RC International Radio. That's right. You heard it. RC International Radio. If you're wondering what RC stands for on a ufology and paranormal network, it is radio controlled. And it is hosted by myself, Jamie Havocan, and my sidekick, Donnie Eatman, every Saturday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, 8 a.m. Pacific. Tune in, call in, ask questions. Do what me and Donnie been up to, upgrading our cars, and listen to stories from other people who call in and share their experiences or ask for advice. That's RC International Radio, Saturdays, 11 a.m. Eastern. I'll see you there.
Hi, folks. This is Ray Hobbs.
And this is Royce Fitzgerald.
And we're with Eyewitness Radio. And we wanted to stop by just to remind you that every Thursday night, 7 to 9 p.m. Eastern, you can catch us right here on the Inception Radio Network. You know, every Thursday, we bring you the brightest minds, the bravest investigators, the best authors and researchers in the field of ufology, as well as the latest news from the Mutual UFO Network.
And don't forget, Ray, we'll be taking questions in the interactive, listen live and chat room, as well as toll-free call-in questions towards the end of the show.
That's right, Royce. So be here to join us every Thursday night from 7 to 9 p.m. Eastern for the Eyewitness Radio Show right here on the Inception Radio Network.
Hey guys, Jamie Havocan here to tell you about Haunted Cornwall FM, which is the UK's first and only paranormal radio show. The show covers a wide range of subjects to do with the paranormal and is always open for discussion and debate, and is hosted by John. The show can be heard right here on Inception Radio Network, Sundays, 3 p.m. Eastern Time, for a 2-hour show. Be sure to check it out. That's the Haunted Cornwall FM radio show, Sundays, 3 p.m. Eastern. I'll see you there.
And welcome back to the Stench of Truth radio show here on InceptionRadioNetwork.com. I'm here every Friday from 7 to 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and my guest this week is Marcus Allen from Nexus magazine in the UK, and we are talking about Dark Moon, Apollo and the Whistleblowers, and the Apollo Moon landings mystery, fact or fiction today. Now, we had just been finishing talking about some of the aspects of Apollo 13 and why it might have been necessary to come up with a terrible emergency to once again galvanize public opinion for NASA as being a reason why, if the Apollo program was basically a myth, why would they need to go through the idea of having an emergency with one of the Apollo missions? And I think Marcus has explained that fairly well, in that throughout Apollo 12, the video footage had been lost, and basically people weren't watching and listening, and they needed something to get people interested again. So what would be better than to have an emergency to cause everybody to bite their nails and wonder if the brave astronauts would make it back to Earth in one piece. And of course they did, with the amazing Omega watches and a type of computer that probably would be less powerful than a very cheap calculator that you would get today. They did everything just perfect and came back just fine. But I want to devote this last section here to ask Marcus to comment on the fact that if we are contending that what NASA is telling us is a lie, and that the Apollo programs, as advertised at least, that supposedly sent the named astronauts to the moon, how do we then look at the astronauts themselves in light of this? Are we looking at people who have been told to foster a lie, and out of patriotism or some other reason they have kept to that story throughout this period of time? What exactly is going on there? Marcus, take it away.
Probably one of the most interesting aspects of the whole Apollo mission. We've got cameras, we've got all the other technical equipment, but they're not people. When you look at the astronauts, they are real people. The Apollo astronauts, as I mentioned earlier, are very famous. Most people can name several of them. Not everybody can name some of the shuttle astronauts, for instance, who were basically technicians, space cowboys. The Apollo astronauts were promoted as basically heroes. Right at the beginning, a very interesting contract was drawn up between the Apollo astronauts and Life magazine. That contract allowed Life magazine exclusive rights to the lives of the Apollo astronauts. You may even remember, if you were interested at the time, seeing such and such an astronaut at home with his lovely wife and his lovely children. The children weren't featured too highly. The astronauts were promoted almost like celebrities are today. There was a great deal of interest. That's why we know so much about them. But the point about this contract was that the astronauts, almost uniquely in terms of a contract with a major publisher, as Life magazine was, had editorial control over what was published. Almost uniquely. Quite why it was issued, I can guess at it. I don't know for certain. It would appear that the astronauts would only agree to this intrusion into their lives if they had control over what was said. There was no intrusive doorstepping of their parents and their friends and other things like that. So they had control over what was published about them. Now, every single astronaut, every single Apollo astronaut was in the military. Had been a long-standing member of the military, usually the Air Force. They were test pilots, by and large. That's what Neil Armstrong was. Buzz Aldrin was a very experienced pilot. Neil Armstrong actually fought in the Korean War. Despite him being promoted as a civilian, he was military. If you're in the military in America, it would be the same in Britain. The esprit de corps of those people at the top of their game, and they were at the top of their game, the esprit de corps would be such that if they were asked by their commander-in-chief, I should say by your commander-in-chief, the president, to jump, they only would have one question: how high, sir? In other words, they were under military orders, and they were under military security, every single astronaut. If they were asked to do something, it would be a mission on behalf of their country and the people. They would do it. They would not question it. They would carry out their orders. That's what military people do. They carry out orders. So there will be no astronaut breaking ranks. There will be no astronaut coming up, even with a deathbed confession, and say, well, actually, no, I didn't get there. They won't do that. That's not the way military men behave. So there won't be any final explanation, even when the last astronaut has passed on. And many of them are still alive. The last astronaut will pass on at one point. And the questions will still arise, and because they won't be around to answer them, we'll be no wiser. The men who would have been part of the cover-up, I think that would be the safest way of describing it, who worked at NASA, I would reckon that the most there would be between 40 and 50 people who would have had knowledge, real knowledge, of what was going on. Because, I mentioned earlier, there were 400,000 people working on the Apollo program. They were building the rockets and all the rest of it. They didn't have a need to know. This is a compartmentalized organization. NASA is not civilian. It's the civilian face of the Department of Defense. That's why the space shuttle is the shape it was, because it launched spy satellites. That was its job. Department of Defense was the real contractor, but it was promoted as a civilian organization. Now, in order to carry out the mission that it was doing, it was basically, NASA has two missions. One is military, one is civilian. The civilian side of it is really quite unimportant. What you've got to ensure is that nobody breaks rank. So, 400,000 people work with NASA, on the Apollo program. They were building the best rockets, the best control centers, the best landers, the best rovers, the best space suits that they could. But if you were building a rocket, you had no need to know about the photography or the filming. If you were filming, you had no need to know about the spacesuits. It's compartmentalized, which is why I say that probably 40 or 50 people at the top would have had a knowledge of what was going on. Beyond that, everybody else was doing the best job they could. And it was a very good job that they did.
Well, I think one thing that perhaps should be mentioned here, I mean, when you look at some of the archival footage of like the Space Center and the technicians and everything manning their various computers and whatnot, it seems as though there are all these people that are doing all of these things to make sure everything is well coordinated and what have you. But as you point out, it should be noted and noted well that these people are doing very specialized tasks. They are told basically what it is that they're doing, whatever data is coming across their computer and what have you. They are told to enter whatever inputs and things of this nature. They could basically just be playing a computer game with that console, and they would be none the wiser compared to actually flying a spacecraft or helping to fly a spacecraft. So in that particular aspect, there would be many, many, many people, many of those hundreds of thousands of people that were employed in the space program that would have been completely outside the loop of a knowledge of the entire project itself from beginning to end.
Exactly. That's a very good point to make. That, in fact, it's ironic. The people who were looking at all those TV screens in the control centers as we waited with bated breath for the one small step that was about to happen were almost playing computer games, or what we call computer games today. What was on their screen, how would they know where it came from? How would they know that what they were watching was not a recording of a previous real-time mission? Because all the Apollo missions were recorded in real time. As they simulated them, they built very, very good simulators. There are photographs of these simulators. They built a model of the moon, 20 foot in diameter, and filmed it as if a spacecraft was approaching it. That model is actually still in San Francisco today. You can go and see it. So there was a lot of artifact about it. What they were watching, did they know that they were watching a screen in real time? That it was actually coming from the moon, that it wasn't being transmitted by a satellite? No. You say, well, how could you fake something coming from the moon? Very easily, as it happens. It was discovered way before Apollo, way before spacecraft. If you bounce a radio signal off the moon, you could pick it up on Earth. You just need a big enough receiver. So one point that is normally leveled at me, saying, well, how can you explain all those lasers being bounced off the moon? I say it's very easy to explain them. You fire a big enough laser at the moon, it'll bounce back, and you'll pick up a few photons of light by the time it gets there. And I normally then ask the supplementary question to that is, when you fire a laser at the moon, what diameter is it when it gets to the moon? If it's 1 centimeter in diameter when it leaves Earth, what diameter is it when it gets to the moon? The answer is 2 kilometers. So if it's 2 kilometers in diameter when it hits the moon, because lasers do spread, despite people saying that they don't, they do spread over nearly 250,000 miles. What diameter will it be when it gets back to Earth? Pretty big. So you just need a very, very big receiver to pick up a couple of photons of light and say, oh, look, I've hit the moon. Up until very recently, nobody could tell you with any degree of conviction or certainty the exact physical location of any of the Apollo landers on the lunar surface. They could tell you within 2 or 3 kilometers, but no more than that, because somebody actually asked that question. Oh, please tell me, where did Apollo 11 actually land? What are the coordinates of its landing position? And nobody could come up with an answer. And eventually, it was that German researcher, Gerhard Wisniewski. He got 10 different answers as to where Apollo 11 actually landed. And these famous reflectors are supposedly placed there by Apollo 11, Apollo 12, and Apollo 14. Trouble is, they placed two of them too near the lander, and the dust blown up covered the reflectors, so it couldn't be used. So in other words, what you're saying is that we're supposedly firing lasers at mirrors that NASA does not know where they're at. So how can we fire a laser at a mirror that they can't tell you where they were placed? If they don't know where Apollo 11 actually landed, the exact coordinates of it, they certainly could not fire a laser at an even smaller object that was placed nearby in order to get a reflection back from it. Exactly. But if the laser is 2 kilometers in diameter, you can point it in the general direction of Apollo 11 or whatever one you're aiming at. But the point is that the lunar surface is reflective. That's why we can see it. It reflects sunlight, but it doesn't reflect very much. It has a reflectivity of about 7%. So 7% of the light hitting it gets reflected, and that's why we see it as the moon. If you fire a radio signal or a radar beam, that'll be reflected off the moon. There won't be much coming back to Earth, but it'll be enough to pick up. This was discovered, actually, by it was the CIA in 1961. They wanted a secure means of communication between continents. And they discovered if they sent a radio signal up to the moon, it would bounce back and you could pick it up in Europe if you fired it from America. Very convenient. Nobody else could intercept it. They wouldn't know what the codes were anyway. So they had a secure means of communication. So all these guys reading their television screens at Houston, how do we know what they were looking at? Was it a recording that had been taken earlier and was just being replayed for their convenience? Did somebody know what to play? Did anything happen that would draw people's attention to an anomaly? That has been dramatized rather successfully in the film Capricorn 1, which was made in 1977.
Fascinating film, by the way.
Yeah, I mean it's a great piece of drama. It's a great piece of filmmaking, but it raises a very interesting point. And then you've got the Diamonds Are Forever, the James Bond film, which features an astronaut, slow motion movement across the lunar surface as James Bond tries to escape the baddies and takes the lunar buggy and drives it through the set. Great fun. And
yes.
We haven't even got on to the possible filmmaker himself, who might have had a hand in the whole Apollo filmmaking process, because they're good films.
And that would have been Stanley Kubrick, presumably.
You're right, sir. You're right. I didn't like to mention it in case it wasn't generally known, but yes, he is supposed to have had a consulting role. Many people will say he couldn't possibly have had time. He was filming the film 2001: A Space Odyssey. But I think there is an interesting connection with Stanley Kubrick's final film, Eyes Wide Shut, and one of the conditions that Stanley Kubrick placed on the release of the film was its world premiere date would be the 16th of July, 1999. I don't believe Kubrick, with his knowledge of films and space, specified that date by mistake, the 30th anniversary of the landing of Apollo 11.
Indeed. I actually had on my show Jay Widener, if you're familiar with him.
Very interesting man. He does some brilliant research in that whole area.
Yes, he produced a film that examines the Apollo footage and comes up with a very interesting solution as to what may have been going on with some of the anomalies seen in the films, and that is that there was a front screen projector being used on sound stages here on Earth, and some of the anomalies that are seen can be explained by the fact that a front screen projection system was in place. So, at the very least, with the material in Dark Moon and some of the stuff that we touched on today, what we can say is that the photographic record that we've been given seems, by and large, to not be a real, accurate portrayal of anything that supposedly went on the moon. Now, there is also something that was brought up in Dark Moon, and we only have a moment to discuss, and that is the idea that the Russians, as you quite rightly pointed out, Kennedy had indicated that NASA should cooperate with the Russians, and the Russians were involved in various aspects of our space program. I guess you could view some of it as a joint space program, but this was not anything that was well known by people. In fact, it was pretty much unknown. And one of the contentions in Dark Moon is that there was a possibility that we did go to the moon in a joint mission with the Soviet Union, and that we had astronauts that would go up into orbit and they would meet up with Russian spacecraft up there, and that the Russians were actually able to construct sturdier, more durable equipment that would have been able to survive the radiation better and make it to the moon. Now, there would also be some question as to whether or not they would be able to get back and things of this nature. So keeping it secret may have been not only for political advantage, it may have been for the reason that maybe some astronauts did go to the moon. Maybe there were several missions, and maybe all of them failed to return.
Yeah, that I think is probably as near the truth as we're going to get for the next few years anyway. Because getting man to the moon really wasn't that difficult. The rockets were certainly powerful enough for a one-way trip. The real problem of getting to the moon was getting back. And if it was decided that they had to get there, but we're not going to get back, then cooperation with the Russians would have been the obvious solution, because the Russians didn't have quite as many qualms about human life as America does. So to send a Russian astronaut who was willing to go on a one-way mission is a possibility. There's no proof of it. There's no evidence for it. But when you take away all the evidence for Apollo and add in the evidence for the cooperation with the Soviets at the time, and that had been going on for a long, long time, it makes much more sense that the achievement to get to the moon was using the hardware that the Russians had come up with, because their lunar lander was tough. It was the correct shape. It was spherical, because that's the shape you use in space. It wasn't the sort of spider-like lunar lander that we've got. Very photogenic thing, but it's not terribly accurate for the survival of humans. And that's where we've got today.
Yes.
A real mystery. Maybe
Indeed.
Somebody will get back one day. Maybe Richard Branson will get there. I don't know.
Well, we're certainly seeing a private interest in that. So perhaps, and we have the Chinese, we have the Indians, we have lots of other people who are interested in pursuing that. So maybe we'll actually have an answer at some point. I certainly hope so.
I hope that I'm around to find the real truth, so that the stench of truth is no longer out there.
A wonderful plug there, Marcus. Thank you very much. Well, we're winding down here. We got our last minute left. I want to express my thanks to Marcus Allen for joining us today. I want to once again recommend the magazine Nexus to anybody out there who's not familiar with it. Go out and grab a copy. I think you'll find it very interesting, filled with all kinds of good information, things that people who listen to Inception Radio would be interested in. Marcus Allen from Nexus UK here today talking about the Apollo moon landings, fact or fiction, and the book Dark Moon, Apollo and the Whistleblowers by Mary Bennett and David S. Percy. Next week I have my guest Gary David. You can check his website is called theorionzone.com, and He'll be my guest next week from 7 to 9 p.m. And stay tuned for Inception Radio next with Jamie and co-host Bill Burns. And join me again next week, 7 to 9 p.m. here on Inception Radio Network for another episode of The Stench of Truth.
Testing my volume. Testing my volume. Wow, you guys can actually hear me. How is that possible? Oh, I hit the red button. Okay, testing. That's weird.